Well, again, welcome. And as people join, I thought I'd get started because we have a pretty packed agenda this morning. Welcome to the CRC Roundtable, a monthly virtual seminar series. If you haven't been here before, our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances with management needs. The webinars are designed for contribution, not all consumption. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 to 30 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for open discussion that I'll facilitate through the chat. This is all about us, giving us a place to ask the clumsy questions and practice a little bit of bravery and humility. So let me start, as we always do, by understanding why this topic at this time by these speakers. Today, we continue our exploration of how to integrate social science tools into the work of the partnership, which began with December's roundtable that focused on behavioral change campaigns and tools to make them more effective. That was all recognizing that the easy things have been done, and our challenge now is a non-point one involving the on-the-ground actions of the 18 million residents of the watershed. February's roundtable looked further into how to incorporate a social science lens into environmental management work. And as we continue to dive deeper into social science tools, we now find ourselves considering our decision and planning processes themselves, especially how to effectively devise strategies to meet our non-point source reduction goals. And if I can have the next slide, Macon. And what we do often to devise those strategies is utilize what's termed participatory natural resource policy and management processes. So participatory processes refer to stakeholders' involvement in the planning or decision-making process. And there are 5 recognized types that differ in the levels of communication and public, the way that stakeholders are actually engaged in the decision-making. And it goes from informing, which is really a one-way flow of information from expert and decision makers to the public and stakeholders, all the way up to a final level of empowering, where almost all parts of the project, from problem articulation to solution proposals to the implementation of the plan, occur in collaboration with stakeholders. Utilizing higher levels of participatory processes are time-consuming, which you can see on the left. They aren't used very often. They do take expertise and effort, but they have the potential to have rather significant long-term benefits. Why would we look at these processes at this point in time in this webinar? I think examining the success of those and what we have learned to date about their value is especially relevant as we approach our 2025 assessment of achieving our goals and consider what our vision of a healthy and productive bay is going forward. Why these speakers? I would say agriculture is most notably the focus of much of these strategies and management effort associated with addressing non-point sources of nutrients. And Pennsylvania is the place to look at that. Farming represents the backbone of Pennsylvania's heritage, with 52,000 farms and 7.3 million acres of farmland. Both of our speakers work with stakeholders to create a vision for sustainable and thriving agriculture in Pennsylvania and the Chesapeake watershed at large, and to inform policymakers on how best to achieve that vision, utilizing participatory processes. Megan, you can go to the slide with the speakers on it. I'm happy to introduce both our speakers. I've worked with them, and they're powerful people in their own right. Lara Fowler is a longtime and trusted colleague, one of those rare people who speaks truth in a generous manner that allows everyone to move forward, and that's a rare trait. By profession, she is an attorney and mediator focused on environmental and natural resource law, including water rights, water quality, flooding, tribal law, and Endangered Species Act issues. She comes with a deep trust of participatory processes and their ability to move us towards solutions. And she has a rich history of working on thorny issues like water resource issues in the West and Pennsylvania agriculture, where she can make a difference. I would say Jill Whitcomb shares the same fearlessness as Lara, evidenced by her current role where she oversees the administration, coordination, implementation, data collection, and reporting of Pennsylvania's Chesapeake Bay watershed goals, objectives, and outcomes. I've looked over her professional arc of her career, and what's impressive is she has been involved with every level of agricultural conservation efforts, from on-the-ground experience to overseeing Chesapeake Bay watershed restoration programs and outcomes, and highly involved in the program she's going to talk about with the voluntary participation of 34 counties in the development and implementation of countywide action plans. Each of our panelists have extensive experience. Each of them could fill an hour by themselves, but I've asked them to limit their remarks to a very short time period, and that's a challenge. I will gracefully let them know when they have 10 and 5 minutes left. If you have questions, I'll remind you that we don't get to during the discussion. We do follow up with our panelists and provide answers to those questions. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Lara, who's going to begin, who's going to hand it off to Jill, who is then going to hand it back to Lara for a wrap up before discussion. So welcome.
Thanks, Denise, and thanks for setting this up. This is always a topic happy to talk about, and we're going to bookend it. This actually, for those who are participating in the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee discussion yesterday, this is going to be a complementary presentation, but not duplicative. And we were asked to speak about implementing clean water solutions for agriculture in Pennsylvania. Go to the next slide. This is coming from actually a place of a series of conversations over the last, what year is it, 2023, 7 or 8 years of really thinking about how do we have healthy and productive agriculture in Pennsylvania and healthy and productive streams. So in 2016, Penn State actually helped foster and convene a set of about 130 people to have a discussion in Hershey, Pennsylvania for 3.5 days with this question: Can we have both of these things? We all eat and we want clean water. What does this look like? And I was really struck by one of the participants' comments of, this finally feels like we can all pull together to make a difference, that it's not just agriculture with a big hot spot on its back and that is to blame for what has happened, but that we can actually start to find solutions. Next slide. That 2016 conversation was really interesting because after 3.5 days of a deep dive, A, people were willing to get together for a picture, which you can see on the left, but B, people didn't want to leave. They were basically like, this is the first time we've really had this really deep, engaged conversation that's very hopeful about how do we balance these interests. And the report that came from it, the Pennsylvania and the Balance report, next slide, I think focused on a number of key themes. How do we embrace a culture of stewardship? How do we develop and deploy effective targeting, integrate soil health, manure management, and riparian ecosystem into water quality strategies? Think about the bottom-up community-based approaches to address these really thorny questions. Do a lot of outreach and planning, technical assistance and funding. Revisit and retool conservation incentive programs, particularly hot topic this year, given the Farm Bill and pending discussions, and collaboratively seek new funding opportunities. Next slide. A lot of these went into, and I'm not going to read through all of what's on both of these lists, but focusing those priority conservation measures and supporting farmer acceptance and increased participation went into the phase 3 watershed implementation planning for Pennsylvania and the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm going to hand this to Jill, who's going to walk you through, I guess in 2019, what you see there, we had that first discussion in 2016 and then realized we needed to reconvene people in 2019. We did so in March of that year with the idea that this phase 3 watershed implementation planning process was going to happen. So Jill, you can pick up the story and then I'll come back.
Thank you. And so I like to start things off with the bottom line up front, especially for a group like this, so that you know kind of the basic 3 elements that we really want you to walk away with. First, we have been engaging with thousands of stakeholders. And I really like Denise's diagram at the beginning. We started out with informing, consulting, and now we got through into the empowerment stage. Second, we work together with our universities such as Penn State, our county conservation districts, and federal partners to continue to engage with the agricultural industry in Pennsylvania through education and outreach, financial, planning, technical assistance, compliance assistance, and insurance programs associated with our regulatory programs as well. And then third, finally, we have, along with our federal partners at NRCS and FSA and EPA, have been investing in agriculture across the Commonwealth for decades, but really with a specific focus on the Chesapeake Bay watershed, because that's where the resources are, and that's where the resources have been truly directed. So going back to Laura's points about those key themes coming out of this 2016 PA and the Balance Conference, that really was the springboard into our phase 3 WIP development. And developing and deploying effective targeting is really essential. First, though, I want to take a moment to step back on our journey to success. So we started in 2017, and really the structure, the hierarchy of the phase 3 WIP planning process, the high level planning process, started out with a steering committee at the very top. So we had all 3 cabinet secretaries of DEP, DCNR, and Department of Ag co-chairing this steering committee. We had action leaders. Those people are not only agency folks, but also external people that work with Penn State Extension, for example, and the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania. They served as the action leaders. And then we also had these active WIP work groups. And I'm just going to focus here on the agriculture WIP work group. It was comprised of 11 members, 4 co-chairs, and a technical coordinator. And the membership was really a really great cross-section of the agriculture industry in Chesapeake Bay watershed in Pennsylvania. We had individual farmers, we had CAFOs and non-CAFOs. We had industry representatives from Penn Ag Industries, for example. We had conservation district representation, as well as private ag consulting at the table. The 4 co-chairs, 4 is a lot, but it really, really needed to happen. We had representation from DEP, Department of Ag, Penn State, as well as the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, kind of heading up that WIP work group. And we went through this whole process of engaging and seeking feedback and recommendations to the final phase 3 WIP. When we talk about developing and deploying effective targeting, we have a very broad scale, a lot of land mass within the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Pennsylvania. And so we through the local action goal work group, they decided and they developed a strategy for breaking it down into counties, breaking it down into tiered groups. Each tier represents 25% of the nitrogen load to the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see Lancaster and York make up 25%, a whole quarter of the nitrogen load to the Chesapeake Bay. And then we broke it down that way. And just from a visual perspective here, all of these agencies, these entities, these groups surround the counties. We're there to support them because that's really where the work gets done. It doesn't get done at my desk, doesn't get done at any other level except on the ground and at the local level. Another aspect of the key themes of the 2016 conference is integrating that soil health and manure management, riparian ecosystem stewardships into our water quality strategy. So again, using what came out of that 2016 conference as the springboard, as the foundation to what are we going to focus on in our phase 3 WIP? What practices, what BMPs should we highlight? What priority initiatives should there be? So we identified these priority initiatives in the agriculture sector. Agriculture compliance is number 1. That is basically meeting the regulatory requirements of our erosion and sediment control, manure management, nutrient management regulations in Pennsylvania. Soil health is comprised of cover crop and conservation tillage and no-till, those residue management practices, as well as prescribed grazing. And then expanded nutrient management, manure storage facilities, all of these things come together, along with forest grass riparian buffers. And then to top that, we went through and said, well, again, there's a lot to focus on. Where do we start? What do we focus on? And so we looked at cost-effective strategies, right? Cost-effective practices that can be utilized and implemented pretty much anywhere. And so these are our top 4, and clearly they align very much with what came out of the 2016 PA and the Balance Conference. And then I just also want to highlight here, because some of us are data geeks, myself included, we do compile data from 40 different programs. And it's like, I think every year we add more, like 1 or 2 or 3 more every year to help document our numeric progress. And just again, kind of some background on that is the idea here is for us to demonstrate that we have the programs and practices in place to meet water quality standards at a certain date, right? So how do we document that? We document that through water quality monitoring, of course, but we also document that through reporting of the practice implementation of the things that are happening on the ground to improve, restore, and protect water quality. And for those who are interested, you can read through our quality assurance project plan and BMP verification program guide as well on our Tracking Pennsylvania's Progress website. Another key theme is to support community-based approaches. So again, we really honed in on the local action, and I really have to hand it to my staff and my team that worked with individuals and worked with these communities and continue to work with them to implement their plans. Each county was provided the opportunity to develop their own countywide action plan. So throughout the development of our phase 3 WIP, part of what the local area goals work group worked on was a pilot process. We have 4 pilot counties that we worked with. They got to test drive this process to effectively develop their own plan. Still in alignment with the phase 3 WIP, still in alignment with what our goals and outcomes are for nutrient and sediment reductions toward the Chesapeake Bay, but really focusing in on their local communities and their local streams. So how do we do that? We worked with 34 counties in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The reason why 34 and not 43, because there's 43 that touch the watershed, but some of them are minimal loading. You know, they don't have a high loading amount, and so the cost benefit of them participating in this process really didn't even out. They're still implementing things. They're still doing and implementing state programs and their own local programs, but they weren't asked to develop their own plans. So each one of them decided to voluntarily complete their countywide action plan. And we provided a lot of tools and resources to them, a planning guide. Each county received a technical toolbox, and we worked with SRBC to help develop those technical toolboxes, and then also an implementation guide. We provide funding for coordinators at the county. So each county can contract or hire coordinators to help kind of shepherd the process. And then we work directly with those coordinators back and forth to receive and provide feedback. It's a continual feedback loop. They are continuing to implement their BMPs and other clean water efforts in support of clean water for the Chesapeake Bay, but also really keying in on their local needs. Recognizing and supporting a 3-pronged approach. So what does that mean? That's education and outreach and awareness. That's financial and technical assistance. And then there's also compliance assurance and assistance there. And I just want to kind of remind everyone that we have been providing funding through our state and federal grants programs to conservation districts, primarily to do this work, to provide outreach and planning and technical assistance and administration. Now, there's tons of work to do. Denise noted that there's 52,000 farms in Pennsylvania. About roughly 30,000 of them are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed alone in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot. There's a lot of work to do, and there's also a need for more people, more technical assistance. But this is what we have been able to provide to date, and we're trying to expand that out as much as we can. We have ag-focused training and technical support. So technical training for staff. We have been funding PA One Stop, which is a PennState planning tool for manure management and Ag E&S planning, as well as web-based training on the Clean Water Academy. Tons of information available, really kind of starting to ramp up through the COVID pandemic, because we couldn't get out and talk to people. We couldn't get out and train them. So what the next best thing was to record webinars and to provide training materials and modules, and have people be able to go at it at their own pace and refresh their memories on what's going on and what they can do. And then again, because there's a compliance component to all of this, right? So not only do we have the concentrated animal feeding operation, the CAFO permitting program, but we also have a nutrient management program for high animal density operations that are considered concentrated animal operations. They have to meet nutrient management requirements. And then in 2016, through the Chesapeake Bay restoration strategy, again, in alignment with the 2016 PA in the balance, there was this new inspection program that came about to focus on the smaller farms, those operations that didn't hit those thresholds to be a concentrated animal operation or a CAFO, but are still nonetheless ones that we really need to focus on for water quality improvement and to help them in their sustainability and implementing conservation practices. And then in 2020, we started kind of going into the next phase of that program to try to ensure that they're implementing projects, but also to verify what they have already implemented. That is a huge deal, and I could talk about that forever. But verification of previously implemented practices so that they can be accounted for toward our water quality restoration efforts. And then collaboratively seeking new funding opportunities. I'm not going to read all of this. I included some links for people to look into further if you're interested. Anything noted as new is new since the 2016 PA in the balance. And so there's a lot of new funding, new opportunities coming up. About the Pennsylvania Farm Bill is, I think, the first and maybe only of its kind in the country. The state budget this past year was unprecedented in the amount of funding going toward agriculture programs and the Keystone Tree Fund and those types of things, not only within the watershed, but also statewide. We have our countywide action plan block grant program. So again, when we talk about voluntary opportunities to develop their own plans, we incentivized it by saying, look, if you develop your own plan, you'll be able to access more resources, not only dollars in a flexible kind of allocation-based program, but access DEP staff. We work with them directly on a regular basis, and they provide feedback on program improvements. And it's always very constructive, and we use that to make improvements to our policies and programs. We have our Growing Greener Plus program, which is a flagship funding program in Pennsylvania, statewide program that goes toward Nonpoint source projects, water quality and watershed improvement projects across the state. And then the EPA Section 319 Nonpoint source management program, which is again, a foundational competitive grant program in Pennsylvania. We work with NIFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, their Small Watersheds and Innovative Nutrient and Sediment Reduction Program. I also want to highlight these two, the DCNR Community and Watershed Forestry Program and the Abandoned Mine Land and AMD Grant Program. While not necessarily specifically oriented to agriculture, the Watershed Forestry Program can be used in agriculture settings and land uses. And the AML and AMD programs are a big deal to a lot of our northern tier counties. They have a lot of issues up there with acid mine drainage and abandoned mine lands. And so it's really important that we highlight these because it's really fully looking at the non-point source pollution problem more holistically.
Billy, you have about 10 left, 8 to 10 minutes.
Got it. Thank you. And then moving into some of our more federal funding programs, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation administer the Most Effective Basin Agriculture Program on behalf of Pennsylvania through an RFP with EPA. And then last but not least is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act federal funding that is directed to Pennsylvania and other states, as well as to NIFWIF. So this started last year, and this is now the second fiscal year that we will be receiving IIJA funding toward most effective basin project implementation. And then I just want to wrap up my section with some highlights and resources. For those of you who are interested, we have published 2 annual reports so far. The 2021 Healthy Waters, Healthy Communities annual report, specifically on our Chesapeake Bay efforts. And then also every year since we started in 2017, the Ag Inspection Program annual summary. So we have the annual summary of the total amount, total farm numbers, inspected compliance rates, those types of things are also published on our website. You can look into more detail about what the Bureau does, what the Bureau of Watershed Restoration and Non-Point Source Management does. We also posted our Phase 3 WIP. If you want to learn more about countywide action plans, each one of them is published to our website with associated materials. If you live in a county and want to know more about how you can join in and assist in the process, there's an opportunity to contact your local county coordinator. We have posted also our programmatic milestone commitments and progress reports that we submit to EPA, as well as some of our other more or less tracking programs on the Track Pennsylvania's Progress website. And then last but not least, I always like to put a plug out for our monthly e-newsletter. For those of you who aren't already subscribed, please do so. We have posted all of our monthly newsletters going back to June 2020 when we first started this. And every month you'll receive new information about funding programs, not only coming from DEP, but our extended partnership, as well as from the counties. The counties like to share some success stories and spotlights that's going on in their neck of the woods. So with that, I'll hand it back to Lara.
Thanks, Jill. And partly what we wanted to do, when Denise reached out and asked if we would talk about this, it was like, sure, there is a tremendous amount happening, and a lot of it's behind the scenes. I think it's certainly possible for people to see it, to track the newsletters. But as I've been working with colleagues at the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, the chronic question that comes out is, Pennsylvania is such a contributor of nutrients and sediment to the Bay. What are you doing? And I'm like, there is a ton happening, but it's hard to see sometimes. So we really wanted to share that. The other thing that happened this past year is, realizing that the amount of funding coming through was quite a bit. Our leadership group that had helped with the 2016 and 2019 discussion said, we think it's time for another discussion. There are so many ongoing challenges and deadlines coming up. We're seeing a historic level of state and federal investments coming through, but we need to make sure that we're actually ready to rapidly deploy, that we have a policy framework, that we're ready to go, and that we actually meet our conservation objectives. We do not want to look up in 5 or 10 years and go, we missed the boat. So in December of 2022, we held round 3 of Pennsylvania in the Balance. And it was really fun. I'll show you on the next slide. Don't go to it yet. But the list of people who are involved, who are all like, yes, we're super busy. We're rolling up our sleeves. We're diving in. But we focused on action. How do we integrate our funding and get it delivered more effectively on the ground for real differences? Can we ensure that we have adequate technical assistance? Can we develop corporate partners? And I'll dig into that a little bit more. Can we link this to not only water quality concerns, but climate smart commodities? Quite a bit of federal funding coming through in that. And really, again, key on that solutions oriented actions. We wanted to make sure that farmers and producers were part of the discussion. So you actually see in that picture 2 different farmers and producers who walked us through how they were approaching these issues and gave us some real feedback. You can't read it on the right side of the slide, but what that producer panel basically focused on was, if we have healthy soils, healthy crops, healthy consumers, healthy communities, we're going to have happy farmers, which I think is a message worth bringing forward. Next slide.
I've got 5 minutes, Laura, if you can.
Yep, I can do it. So this is the planning committee. I'm not going to read all these names, but it's a great cross section of people across Pennsylvania really thinking about these issues very hard, from the nonprofit side, the educational side, state agencies, the funder side, you name it. And again, this group met basically every other week for several months, actually, to roll up our sleeves and say, how do we take advantage of this group coming together? Who do we convene for this discussion? How do we have a discussion, and where do we go with it? Next slide. Some key pillars. These are coming from Russell Redding, Secretary of Department of Agriculture for Pennsylvania, saying, let's build on this momentum. Let's think about risk management as we're making these transitions, be it associated with environmental concerns, climate, cost, productivity, et cetera. And then let's mitigate some of these concerns through technical assistance, and again, that improved funding delivery. I'm going to dig just a little bit more into some of these. Next slide. So I guess I cut out some of these slides and shared more of them yesterday, but a lot already underway. So again, is there outreach on the Farm Bill and listening session? Can we make sure that improved funding mechanisms, for example, are really addressed through the Farm Bill? What's the opportunity in that? There's actually work to develop a conservation assistance training center. Jill walked through a number of the different pieces of that, but how do we really leverage what's happening? We don't have enough people on the ground working on these questions. How do we ramp that up and do so very quickly? It's actually today, there's an Exploring Careers in Conservation job fair. A lot of our colleagues who are on that steering committee are actually at Penn State today, 17 different entities trying to get more people into the workforce development. And we're meeting monthly to share updates, explore, and really advance and think through how we collaborate on these things. Last slide, I think. With that, maybe we're right on time, but we are happy to answer questions, have discussions, take ideas, whatever you want to get into. Denise, thanks for helping facilitate the conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks for the tour. That was pretty stunning. I'm proud to be from Pennsylvania. Let me start with a question, and I'm just reminding everyone that I facilitate discussion questions outside of the out of the chat. So please, start filling up that chat with questions, because this is a great opportunity. I think I'll start with it might be sort of an obvious one to start with, but to have both Jill and Lara speak to what was the thinking behind having local equal county level? Like, how is that chosen as, the effective scale of engagement and strategizing, really?
Well, I'll start, and I'll be honest here. That was led by someone other than me, and she is on this call today. So I might ask her to speak to it a little bit. But I think it's important to note that we worked with EPA's Chesapeake Bay Program Office quite a bit in the decision-making of scale of how we focus and where we target our efforts. I recall sitting in a meeting together talking about, well, should we do it on a smaller watershed basis? Should we do it on a larger watershed basis, a HUC 12 basis? And really what it came down to was, because we were going to be working with the government entities, the county planning commissions and the county conservation districts, it made the most sense to draw the line at the county, because they have a finger on the pulse of what's going on as part of their planning aspects, the conservation aspects, and they really have their own needs their own constituencies throughout each county. So I think it really worked out well to separate it out by those by the not the geographic boundary, but the political boundary of the counties.
Mm-hmm. Lara, do you want to comment on that? And have you found that, do you think that's been effective? You've worked with organizations at all different scales.
Yeah. And you see me trying to decode acronyms. I think one of the challenges I found when I came into the Bay program world about 10 years ago was just trying to figure out what in the dickens people were talking about with all these things. So I do think it's actually been effective, as Jill said. I mean, in some of those discussions in 2016 and 2019, there was lots of discussion about, well, what scale is appropriate? And if you take the whole of the Susquehanna River Basin, and by the way, part of the Potomac is actually also in Pennsylvania, it's just too big. It's too large a scale. If you downscale it to sub-watersheds, they may be too small. And so kind of where is that sweet spot? Pennsylvania has, I think one of our big challenges is we have the most number of local governments anywhere in the country. We have 2,562 local townships, municipalities, boroughs, et cetera. And if you add on things like school districts, et cetera, we have a whole lot more. So cooperation across boundaries is always a challenge. But I do see, and what I've started to see in places, you know, the Lancaster Clean Water Partners is doing a fantastic job in Lancaster County of really bridging and pulling people together, leveraging funding, finding those matching resources, and getting a tremendous amount done. We had a chance to do a tour last June out in Lancaster, and it was just really fun to see what was happening on the ground. It's a hotspot if you look at any of the Bay maps of nutrients, phosphorus, and nitrogen coming in, but it's also a hotspot of tremendous innovation. And what you're starting to see, I think, in a lot of the other counties is gaining speed. I mentioned this yesterday during the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. In, I think, 2014, 2015, I was in Center County and talking with folks working in the conservation world. And they basically were like, we pay no attention to what the Bay program is doing. We're not at all tracking the watershed implementation plan. We could care less. I think what you would find today is if you're talking with anybody in a local area, they're very aware of it. They participated in the watershed implementation planning process, and they're thinking hard about, again, almost an overwhelming amount of funding coming through, but starting to leverage that for real action on the ground. And a number of people who are on this call are instrumental in that day-to-day work. So big hats off, because it's a huge amount of work with a lot of progress. So it's making a difference. Is it perfect? No. Are we there? No. Are we making progress? Yes.
Yeah.
Denise, I'd like to allow Kristen Wolf to speak to the local action component, because she's been integral to that.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks, Lara. Can you hear me all right, everyone?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I certainly think Jill and Lara really covered that quite well. One of the things that I do want to recognize in this, just to add to what they're saying, is really that the local action leaders that took the effort and made the effort and took the time to pull this together. So we couldn't have done this process without the action leaders around our collective table that were coming from the nonprofit, the private sector, the county government level, and then the state government level. So we had all of these folks around the table, and one of the things we did, similar to what Jill talked about with the ag work group, is have a local area goals work group that was headed up by the head of the County Commissioners Association, a nonprofit, and then a DEP person. And then we had this cross section of folks that joined that work group so that we could come to this place that Lara and Jill just talked about, where we determine what is the best level to reach folks at the local level in Pennsylvania. And the county just seemed to be the best way to go for us. So the only thing I wanted to add to this, because I know we have limited time, is just that level of effort among our various action leaders that continues through this. That helps us to stay connected, while my team and the folks that we work with at the county level stay connected as well. So it takes a lot of people. It takes a village for this, and by no means is it perfect, but boy, is a lot of exciting stuff happening. So thanks for that opportunity.
Well, thanks for agreeing to make a cameo appearance. It's wonderful. We have some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to start on them. The first one, I think, is rather direct. Is there, from Allison Ulsh, is there an anticipated timeframe for the launch of the Conservation Technical Assistance Program?
Great question. I think as soon as humanly possible, but I can't give a time frame. I don't know, Jill, if you know.
No, I do know that they are meeting very regularly, a group of folks, including the State Conservation Commission, because it's part of the Agriculture Conservation Association, of course, and folks from DEP and Penn State. So I think it's we're moving as fast as we can, but we also want to be thoughtful in the process too, and make sure that we're covering all the bases as we're trying to stand something new up.
Okay.
And one thing that I would say, let me shift gears. So I'm the interim chief sustainability officer for Penn State and directing our Sustainability Institute. And I've been thinking a lot about workforce development in that space. But if you look, and Jill mentioned two sets of federal funding, IIJA, which is the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then more recently, the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Particularly the IRA has ties to workforce development and pretty bluntly says, look, if you want to go for all the tax credits that's available through this federal funding, in a lot of cases, in a year or 2 or 3 years out, you need to have actually paid apprenticeship programs. And my first reaction to that is, ooh, that's hard to do. But my second reaction is that's an opportunity for all of us to think creatively about something like the Conservation Technical Assistance Program and diversifying our workforce, right? Who is coming into this space through paid apprenticeship programs, and how do we reach perhaps non-traditional audiences to do so? So I think there's a convergence of a bunch of things. We can follow up with more specific dates, but I don't think it's quite set in stone yet. People are actively working in this space though.
Yeah, and this might come up in your answer to the next question from Larry Sanford. This is a tremendous lift with great organization. Can you identify the most important choke points for achieving your objectives? You know, and I might say, is workforce development one of those choke points? So how about we, Lara, do you want to go first and then Jill?
Sure. I think workforce development, but we're also hearing there's so much, for years it's been, we don't have enough money. And now there's so much funding coming in that actually I think it's overwhelming. And my concern as a choke point is it's just hard to figure out what money to go after and how to do it and how to leverage those sources. And so for communities or local areas that have figured out, hey, this is the game plan of what we need to do, and they know what their plans are, they're better off to then be able to say, oh, this funding source can match this funding source and this funding source. But that's also a choke point that was identified. Erin Ledovic, who's on as one of the helps with HRG in the county side, during our 2022 discussion, she said, look, you may have one project that, we raised $1 million for, but it took 9 funding sources. That's a challenge. And my fear is I don't want to look up in 5 to 10 years and realize a lot of our local communities could not tap into this money because they lack that fundamental local capacity. Again, as a university, we're really trying to think hard and looking to how other states have done this to build that local capacity, not just in the agriculture and water space, but more generally, flood resilience, for example. In Pennsylvania, we have a ways to go. And I just got an email actually from our colleague with the Local Government Advisory Council raising the same question, like, what are you doing and how do we help in this space? But that's we need enough people working in it to build those trusted relationships, but the capacity to go after this funding, I think, is right now a critical challenge. Jill?
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I would also mention too, is that there's a bit of fatigue that happens when, and this is more of kind of a social kind of communication aspect. When people are told that they're not doing enough and they're busting their tail to get it all done, it's demotivational. So our job is to inspire and to empower our local organizations through whatever means necessary. It's through resources, it's through hearing them out, it's through, meeting with them face to face and meeting where they are and helping them to get to where they want to be in alignment with where we think we should be, right? So I think it's a lot of that keeping people keeping people motivated to continue to do this work, and while feeling overwhelmed and the added stress of how are we going to get this done. And so really, I think one of the things is that we were building this thing, and it's kind of that cliche, but it's kind of true. We were building it in the sky. It was, the plane was flying and we were putting the parts together. And now we were trying to run alongside folks and get them up to speed in that way. But we want to make sure that we continue to engage, and that continuation takes time and resources, not only on our end, but also on the local stakeholder side, and engaging with landowners and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of looking at it from a, here we are today. We want to make sure that the message is that people are doing really great stuff, and we're making improvements, and we're really making progress here. And that should be able to motivate people to do, maybe not do more, but do continue to do what they're doing because it's working.
I would add two quick thoughts to that. One is, and this has come up through lots of different workshops and discussions, we can only move at the speed of trust. And that trust takes time and it takes process. And sometimes you go a little bit slow to move fast, but that's what I see from the bottom up discussions, is that trust being built. I've seen it work, over 25 years of watershed work in Oregon, for example. That bottom up work really can leverage those resources. But the other point, that I already raised, and I think came up adequately quite a bit in the workshop is, one workshop, somebody's like, we don't need to cut red tape, we need to cut green tape, right? We need to be accountable, but we need to be much more nimble than we are, and leveraging those sources. And what's it take to do that may take some creative thought. I was talking with a colleague from PEMA, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management. He's like, I've got a great program. It's working fantastic. My communities know how to tap into it. And then I'm out talking to communities and they're like, we have no idea. And I was working on a grant application to PEMA and I nearly threw up my hands. And I work in the professional grant getting world, right? Where I was like, this is ridiculously complicated and very frustrating. So if you are trying to reach underserved communities, if you are trying to reach communities that have historically been left behind, much of rural Pennsylvania, we need to rethink how we're approaching this.
That's a great point. Thank you. That was a really rich conversation. And with Jill's point about not necessarily doing more, it's interesting how this might relate to the next question by Kristen Saunders, which is, given that this has been focused on WIP implementation and in the agricultural context, do you see opportunities to use this successful collaboration effort and weave in some of the other key outcomes in the 2014 Bay Agreement that may not specifically appear in the WIP, but could be achieved as you work toward multiple benefits? And Kristen is asking, if you do see opportunities for that, what might be some examples of other outcomes? What would be some of those other outcomes that you could tackle in this successful framework?
Well, I think it's important to note that, agriculture and conservation in agriculture is not, no pun intended, not in a silo, right? It really does truly get at those other co-benefits. Lara talked about flood resiliency. So we plant cover crops instead of leaving the ground bare over the winter, right? We plant forest riparian buffers. We do stream restoration projects in the agricultural setting. There are a number of practices that get at those co-benefits of habitat restoration and resiliency. So I think it's really important to highlight and make those connections first and foremost between what we're doing for water quality and how that then also impacts the other goals and outcomes within the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement specific to habitat and climate. And you know, there's the climate smart aspects. You know, we're doing a lot of work, and I think it's just making those connections between carbon sequestration, for example, and biomass on the ground. Biomass could also be, you know, their cover crop and residue management, those types of things, and those activities, conservation practices really do have multiple functions in the landscape.
Thanks, Jill. Laura, any additions?
I would add a couple things to it. I mean, I think right now what you're seeing, I mean, and in my daily world, I work on a variety of different issues, but sustainable aviation fuel, renewable natural gas, right? The water, food, energy nexus, I think, is great opportunities. And there's some creative opportunities to knit and bring these together. I was really struck, and a number of you just are coming from the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, where we're talking about water quality impacts on Vibrio, which is a bacteria that affects shellfish and human health, right? It's nasty, it's toxic, it kills people. It's not a good thing. So how do we link questions like human health into this more? 25% of Pennsylvania's population depends on private drinking water wells and septic. We have no well drilling standards in Pennsylvania. We're one of the only 2 states in the country that do not. That's a big deal for human health. We have nitrate questions in drinking water. Can we improve and think about stacking those benefits in multiple ways? COVID laid very clear the impact to recreation, and particularly in our urban areas, underserved areas, minority areas just didn't have access to the recreational opportunities. So again, can we address some of the environmental justice questions, the recreational aspects of bay restoration? And you see a lot of opportunities, I think, for the local economic development. So if I can improve flooding, open up green space, address water quality, and store carbon, how do I monetize that? But maybe I'm also able to get off stuck. So lots of threads coming together, and by the way, address human health impacts. So I see a lot of opportunities for looking at that broader set of Bay program needs. You know, and what we were hearing yesterday and today is there's going to be a discussion in May about, well, what's next? We're not meeting our targets for 2025 to address and reduce pollution across the Bay, including in Pennsylvania. How do we address this? And I think only by combining some of these other unusual sets of questions can we leverage, again, more resources, but more coordination. And I want to go back to where you started with, which is, I think those local bottom-up efforts actually build the trust necessary then to think more creatively about solutions in these other spaces. I've seen it happen. I've worked with communities in Washington and Oregon in particular, where that it doesn't matter what issue you start with, by building that coalition of the willing, you are able to then leverage into lots of other areas.
I think that's a perfect segue to a question Fred Dobbs had, which is, you know, the processes and the goals and the benefits at the local scale that you're talking about. You don't desire that only for the counties in Pennsylvania that are in, you know, one of the 34 that you looked at, right? That extends to what you want for all the counties in Pennsylvania. And his question was, but you do gain the advantage of a certain sense of urgency and attention if you're in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So his question really is for those counties in the eastern and western section of PA, are those counties on board with the programs you've described? And do those outside the Chesapeake Bay watershed have the same urgency that he perceives from your description of those in the Bay watershed?
I'll start with this one, if you don't mind. So, you know, we have 66 county conservation districts across the state. So the only county without a conservation district currently is Philadelphia. So each one of those county conservation districts has a team of people. They have their resource conservationists or erosion sediment control technicians. They have agriculture folks, and they also have watershed specialists. DEP funds watershed specialists at every county. And they themselves participate in these Growing Greener programs and the Nonpoint Source Management 319 programs. We have a total of 40 local WIPs, local watershed implementation plans across the state. Some of them are centralized to the state, but there are a lot of them outside of that. And many of them are actually focused on acid mine drainage and abandoned mine lands and those types of non-point source issues. There are some that are stormwater based, some that are agriculture based. So there is still activity happening in what I call the bookends of the state, in the Delaware and the Ohio areas. I think one of the constraints and the issues that I wrestle with is the amount of resources that we have to provide to those counties and those areas outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The driving force really has been the total maximum daily load and the timelines and the phase 3 WIP developments and all of that type of thing happening. The driving force in the watershed has been the watershed agreements starting in 1983 and moving up until now. That's 40 years of effort and focus on this particular area. So my roundabout way of saying is that yes, our conservation districts are key to that connection in those areas. They don't have an organized structure like we set with the countywide action plans. That doesn't mean that they're not locally organized. So they have their connections with their watershed associations and organizations and their landowners, and they have been able to build those local relationships and trust over time.
Thanks, Jill. And I would add to that, a couple of years ago, I actually got to go be a speaker at one of the Delaware River, and I'm not going to get it quite right, but sort of winter discussions over there. And I dropped into an entirely different and very rich ecosystem of discussions in the Delaware, different drivers, different motivations, but well organized, a lot of great work from the bottom up. Didn't have the same drivers from the federal thou shalt do this requirements, but it's not to say there was no work happening. There's incredible work happening, and a lot of it was actually very grassroots organized in a whole bunch of different ways. I'll quickly put a note in this. In the Ohio River system, there's a whole different ecosystem driven by very different drivers. You see a lot of discussion about combined sewage overflow and flooding questions, Pittsburgh, and a lot of the issues playing out there, kind of different motivations and different questions. I'm less familiar, though, coming up to speed quickly in that area as well. There is frustration in the other parts of the state of, hey, the Chesapeake gets all the air, and yet there's still great work happening. Again, people are seeing climate change is water change. It is also impacting agriculture greatly. I mentioned that I've done a ton of work in California. California is going extreme weather whiplash from, the worst in 1,200 years for drought to massive floods and very scary conditions because they've got 50, 60, 70 feet of snow and then atmospheric rivers coming down on top of it. Our food supply is not secure based on California and the desert Southwest. So what do we do to protect agriculture across Pennsylvania and use it as part of our ecosystem restoration, but also just our fundamental resilience? The Ohio, the Delaware, the Potomac, the Great Lakes, all of it are a piece of that. And, I do see those discussions playing out across all of Pennsylvania. Penn State, of course, is in all 67 counties. And with students from all of those places. So we are thinking about things not just from a Chesapeake perspective, but from a Commonwealth perspective.
With a minute left, and I want to thank you both in case people have to hop off. That was just an incredible conversation and a presentation. And I'm just going to give you a minute each to, the process has been stunning. And for those of people that are wondering what the investment yields, in the last remaining minute, can I ask each of you to talk about the primary benefits you think come out of a participatory process that you've described? Because you've both worked in that area for a long time, and you must trust it. So I'll let Jill go first, and then Lara.
Sure, I'd say inspiration for the future. That it takes a lot of work, but it's necessary. And just being able to see what people have been able to do in the short span of time that we've worked through this process, think about what we could do 10, 15, 20 years from now. It's mind-boggling, and it really, I mean, I think I could say I truly believe in this process, and it's really inspiring to me to see what's happening.
Great, thanks. Lara, you have the final word.
Yeah, thanks. It took us 300 years to get where we are. Can we fix this overnight? No, we can't. 100 years ago, there were no trees anywhere in Pennsylvania. They were all cut down. We're making extraordinary progress. And I think, to me, what's so uplifting about participatory processes is you can actually roll up your sleeves, work together. You're going to have differences and not be able to figure things out. But if you can actually say, how do we do this? What's the vision of the future that we want? You can accomplish amazing things. And I've seen it, again, my students will often ask, like, how do you deal with despair? I'm like, I have had the privilege of working with local communities to find solutions they never thought were possible, because they figured out the process of working together to find hope and a path forward.
Thank you very much. That's just incredibly powerful and helpful at this point in time. Thanks everyone for joining us. Join us for our next webinar on, I think the date just disappeared, but in April. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jill and Lara. That was fantastic.